Thank you to my colleague who hit record there. So folks, I'm just absolutely delighted to see you all here today. We did turn this around quite quickly, so we were a wee bit unsure if we could gather together maybe a dozen people or so to kick off with this conversation. So we're just over the moon that it gained the momentum that it did, and we can see so many registrations today. Is fantastic. Now, some people have asked that we record the session because they can't make it today, but they're sorry to miss it. So put the option out there to record it, and they've welcomed that. So if you're shy, turn your camera off. But otherwise, we just keep it recording and we put it on to YouTube, providing that it all goes okay, that it doesn't crash or anything. We put it on YouTube, and you can share that with your colleagues if that's helpful. So look. Just to kick off, I'm Anne-Marie O'Keehan. I work with the Centre for Cross-Border Studies, and I manage the Border People project, and I have done for years. So the project, as you might know, provides cross-border information that's relevant to people who have cross-border lives, if you like. So the majority of people, I suppose, are either crossing the border to live, to work, to study, for lots of different reasons. But without a doubt, one of the main cohorts that keep coming back to us are frontier workers. Cross-border employment is often the catalyst. It's the spark that really starts off the questions that have a cross-border nature. Now, because in recent times, many of the people who got in touch with us in recent times were crossing the border regularly every day, and they were returning home, back to home mostly every single day. And that was predominantly before the pandemic hit. That was the pattern and the type of cross-border workers that we were engaging with here with the project. Now, because of COVID, and of course everyone then was starting to work from home, all of these other sets of questions started coming through to us that were very new. Now, the issues that have arisen in recent times are long-standing issues, but it was COVID that really shone the light on it. And that's why we're gathered up here today to try and make sense of it all, if you like. So I have a couple of very keen cross-border advisors joining me here today. So we have Rose Tierney and we have Martin Casey. Rose is a tax consultant based in Monaghan, but although she has a foot in both jurisdictions, so she's a cross-border expert without a doubt. Martin absolutely is another expert as well. He's based in Newry, and he provides cross-border advice to people. He's a cross-border advisor, and both of these individuals have been really, really priceless to the project. Sharing their knowledge with us has been absolutely key to us, I suppose, passing on the information out to individuals. Now, I must say, behind the scenes as well, we've also fantastic links with the advice sectors north and south. And it's those links that help us to take the information out of our tiny project and to flood it through the networks, the really good networks that are already well established in the two jurisdictions. So it's our links then with the advice sector that kind of help us to keep tabs on what's happening on the ground and to gather up as much information as we can in order to push information through to policymakers. Now, one of the main things that hit us in recent times then is this whole working from home phenomenon. And people are really quite, it's very confusing. To work in one jurisdiction or the other is sometimes confusing enough, but whenever it blends together, there's a real confusion there. So we're going to go through an awful lot in a very short period of time. So I'm going to give you a kind of a quick introduction now, just to set the scene a little bit so that we're all on the same page. There's quite a range of people on the call this morning, and there's different sets of skills and different expertise in different places. So I'm just going to try and get us onto the same page, and then Rose and Martin will take us through the more technical aspects. And Martin has some really brilliant live cases of how the policies hit the ground, the real impact on people. So we're going to have a look at tax, social insurance, and the many, many other important issues that people have raised with us, like pensions, income protection, health protection, mortgages, healthcare, all of that. So this is the real day-to-day stuff that we're going to talk about today. We'll also have a wee look at what is happening in other places. We're not the only place with the border region. There are thousands and millions of cross-border workers throughout the European Union. member states, for example. So, you know, we're not alone. There's lessons to be learned in other places. So we'll have a wee quick look at what's happening there, and then maybe consider where should we be going in our own space here down the line. So that's just to give you a wee flavour of what's happening now this morning. So of course the phone has to start ringing. So one of the major things that happens with one of the main questions that come, thank you very much, my colleagues to the rescue. So one of the first questions that comes along to us most often with cross-border workers is, where do I pay income tax? And frequently then we have to give a baseline of information in the project before we pass somebody on to the relevant expert in whichever jurisdiction you know we should be pointing them to. So the baseline of information that we provide, and the advice sector also provides as well, is for the person who commutes across the border full-time, their employer will run one payroll. They will pay their tax and that through that payroll and through their employer. And then that employee also has an obligation then to declare their income back at home, and they'll do that annually. And sometimes that's where the like of Martin and Rose will step in to help them to do that, because the systems are so different. But I'll not go into that. I'll let them explain that in a wee minute or two. So that's the situation whenever a person commutes across the border all of the time. For the people then who work across, who are employed across the border, but they actually work at home full time, all of that switches then to the jurisdiction where they live. The employer run a payroll in that jurisdiction where they're resident, and then they pay tax at home, and they don't have to worry about that declaration then each year. So that's straightforward. But the thing we'll focus on today then mostly is the employers that have to run two payrolls, the employees who have to pay tax via their employer at work and also at home, and then the complications in and around that. But I'll not touch that. I'll leave that one to Rose and to Martin. So the other thing, whenever people come to us, they mention tax, we say, well, have you also considered social insurance? And again, you know, we'll explain, if they commute in full-time across the border, they're going to be part of their employer's payroll in that other jurisdiction, and they'll pay the social insurance into that other jurisdiction across the border. And then that switches back to home again if they are actually working full-time from home. And then this is where the complexities kind of kick in whenever they start to do the hybrid working. The pattern that most people seem to have whenever they're coming to us for advice is that maybe they work mostly from home and go into the office maybe a day or two per week. So in that instance, usually, unless there's a substantial amount of their time spent across the border, it'll all shift to the residence, the place of residence. But we'll go into that in a wee bit more. So that's just to give you a flavour of where we are with social insurance. So they're one of the top two issues that come to us as a project. So the other thing that frequently people don't think about, and it's often overlooked then, is the entitlement to healthcare. So an employee who lives in the north and works in the south, they're going to get healthcare in Northern Ireland due to that residence. They're going to get healthcare on the southern side of the border as well, and they can get it through the means tested medical card system that other residents on the southern side of the border, that they will also be part of that system. On the other side, if we flip the worker, then if they're living in the south and working in the north, they'll get healthcare in Northern Ireland due to their employment. And we saw evidence of that during COVID, of people really relying on that for maybe the vaccinations and that. And they became more and more attuned to, oh, I can actually access healthcare in Northern Ireland then, even though I'm working in the south. So they also get this really good benefit then as well, that they also will be entitled to a medical card on the southern side of the border based on their residence, but because they have absolutely no income earned and not part of the PRSI system on the southern side, they will get an Irish medical card without a means test. So these are the things that all add up whenever a person takes that great opportunity across the border and takes that job. So it all starts to add up, and usually things go great and things go well, but frequently people fall between the cracks in the system, and that's whenever they get in touch with the project. Unfortunately, we mostly hear about the bad stories, not the good stories. But look, so there's a slide there that will recap. I'm going to share all of these slides with you. All of this information will also be shared with you in a briefing paper that will go out in a couple of days. So don't worry about having to take notes. All of this will be shared with you. So I'm going to pass over now to Rose. she's going to start now with the payroll. And Rose, let me just say, I'm going to be able to share the remote with you, so you can work your way through the slides.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Anne-Marie.
Have you?
Yeah, so today is mainly focusing on the work from home and therefore so the hybrid type arrangements where a dual payroll might have to be run. So the work from home rules basically mean that if you've got, say, for example, a Northern Ireland employer and their employee is resident south of the border in the ROI, then they've got to run the full UK payroll in full, but then run a shadow payroll for the ROI duties part of that. So that means running 2 payrolls at the one time. Now, there is a real-time tax credit through the system that they can claim, they take into account the income that's been earned on the other side of the border in terms of the duties on the other side of the border to try and minimise the tax exposure for the employee. But it does cause complications, and it's equal and opposite the other way around as well. If you've got an ROI resident employer and with an NI resident employee, they have to run the payroll in full in the south where they're working part-time from home, say on the other side of the border, then run the shadow payroll for the UK duties. And that again, they've got to run that payroll, fund the taxes, and that's where it runs into complications as well. This becomes quite complex for small businesses that have to do this, where they don't have that resource in-house, and it becomes quite costly as well. We have to outsource this. So usually what happens is, because there's 2 sets of taxes, if you like, have to be accounted for, even with the real-time tax credit, the employer usually finances the shadow payroll taxes. And what that essentially means is they're lending that money to the employee for that period of time during that tax year. And I'll come on to that in a minute as to what that implications of that are. So this, the way the payroll is set up and how much duties are accounted for on either side of the border depends on the work pattern of the employee. So if you've got somebody who's got a straightforward work pattern, 3 days one side of the border, 2 days at home the other side of the border, or vice versa, or something like that, there's a regular pattern. You can work out a system for it, and you can make sure that everything's done correctly. You get a direction from HMRC or the Irish Revenue. You can operate your payroll on that basis. But if your work pattern varies, which it often does, use of somebody that's varies their hours or their duties actually take them either side of the border in the course of their work, visiting customers, clients, or somebody who, say, for example, normally works from the office a few days a week but is allowed with flexibility to lift the laptop and run if there's a sick child and take the laptop home and finish off the job at home, which is quite common, and it happens in my own business quite frequently. Then what you end up with is an irregular work pattern, and that makes it much more complex in terms of running the dual payroll, because their duties aren't sort of split 60-40 every week or whatever it happens to be. I'm trying to see if the mouse now works to move this along. Did I skip one? Yeah. Done now. Okay, so what happens then, if you run the 2 payrolls for a full tax year, then at the end of the year there's a balancing act that has to be done, and the employee has to file a tax return in their country of residency. So if it's an ROI resident, they file a return with the Irish Revenue. If they're living in Northern Ireland, they file a return with HMRC, and on that return they return their worldwide income. So that's the income from both payrolls and any other sources of income that they have. And they take credit for the taxes they've already suffered through those payrolls. So they take into account the tax they've suffered on the home payroll, if you like, with the employer, and the work from home payroll for the jurisdiction where they're living. And so once that's taken into account, then what you could have in most cases is a refund due. And if the refund is due, it's actually due to the employer. So the employee claims it and has to hand it over to the employer. And the reason for that is that the employer usually, in most cases, has funded the taxes for the employee, the shadow taxes. Now, that exercise becomes quite difficult, particularly south of the border, where there's joint assessment. You don't have many joint assessments north of the border because it's only people born around 1934. But south of the border, joint assessment between spouses is very common. And so what you actually essentially have to do is unpick that joint assessment tax return to figure out what the refund to the employer is. And I remember when these rules came in first, long before the whole working from home saga, long before the COVID-19 pandemic, back in 2006 when these rules came into place, I had different employers who were really trying their best to be compliant outside of the border. And a business in Northern Ireland, a couple of employees south of the border that were allowed to carry out some of their work, or had to carry out some of their work, I should say, south of the border, because that's where some of their customers were based. And there was one particular individual who was allowed to work from home a couple of days back then as well. And what happened was that we had to do this exercise every year of doing the filing of the tax returns. The dual payroll was run. tax returns were filed, and then we had to unpick one particular individual's tax return because their tax return was quite complicated. They were jointly assessed. They had they espoused a couple of different employments. There was different tax credits being claimed for different things, tuition fees, dependent relatives. You had to really unpick the whole thing to figure out what goes back to the employer. And this became quite intrusive, if you like, on the couple in question. And eventually there was it came to a head with the employer, and the employer just says, look, I've had enough of this. We're not running the dual payroll anymore. We're going to fix it where you're on payroll one side of the border only, and that's it. End of story. And an awful lot of employers have had to do something similar over the years because they find this is far too complex for small businesses and far too costly as well. So a lot of them are burying their heads in the sand. But the whole point of this exercise and us talking about this is to bring this to the fore now that the spotlight has been shone on it, and to try and figure out a way of simplifying the whole thing on this land border that we have to deal with day to day. So I mentioned earlier the loan that the employee is receiving from the employer by virtue of the fact that the employer is funding the shadow payroll taxes. Well, guess what? There's a benefit in kind charge on that. So for the privilege of having the taxes funded by the employer, there is an extra tax charge on the employee. And the way that's worked out is that the preferential loan rates used for benefit in kind charges, which is 13.5% south of the border and 2.25% since April there north of the border, would be run on the amount of the outstanding loan balance or average loan balance for the year. And that's an extra tax charge on the employee. This stuff is not simple, it's not straightforward, and it'd be nice to see some simplifications coming. And we'll talk about some suggestions in a little while. So if we look at the next one, get my mouse to move here. It's not liking me, Anne-Marie. Oh, sorry, a bit too quick there. Okay. One other area that I've been looking at in relation to the working from home and the changes since COVID, and I realised that an awful lot of local authority workers and civil servants and people working in government jobs, essentially government funded jobs, were unaware that because they were aware of Article 18, a lot of them were aware of Article 18, which is a special article in the treaty for government service roles. And what it says in the double tax treaty between Ireland and the UK is that if you're in a government service role and you provide your services on one side of the border, but you happen to live on the other side of the border, then you're only taxed in the country of employment. You're not taxed in your home country, if you like. So you have no obligation to say, for example, file a tax return with your worldwide income on it, if that's your only source of income. So the certain employees fall into that exemption, certain people who work for local authorities, people who work for educational establishments that are funded by the government, and also mainly high-ranking civil servants. Not everybody falls within it, and it's quite a grey area. Somebody like a nurse might not fall within it because in some case law in the past has been held a nurse provides her services to the public rather than to the government. So there's a grey area there. But what I noticed coming out from the COVID pandemic was that a lot of people who assumed that they were under Article 18 assumed that they're protected by Article 18 from when it comes to the work from home rules. But my reading of it, and I've had some clarification of this as well, is that you're not protected by Article 18. So if you've got, say, somebody who works for a local authority, so say they're resident in the Republic of Ireland and they're an Irish citizen, but they work for a local authority in Northern Ireland normally, and they normally commute, but they're also now working from home part-time in the ROI for that local authority, then that doesn't protect them. They're not just going to be taxed in Northern Ireland anymore. They can also be taxed in the Republic of Ireland because of the way the wording works in the treaty. Because what they say is that if the services are rendered in the jurisdiction where the employee is resident, and the employee is a resident of and a national of that jurisdiction, and didn't just become resident just to render those services, then they can be taxed in their home country as well. So there's no protection there. And I think maybe it's not widespreadly known throughout, say, the local authorities and the government departments that if you're working from home and you live on the opposite side of the border and you're a government worker, that you could potentially be in a dual payroll category, at least in self-assessment category in that regard, because it can be taxed on the other side of the border. So I wonder how many people in those departments actually know that, and whether the people running the payrolls know that. It'd be interesting to know the number of people who are in that situation. I think there's a delay reaction here when I hit the buttons to move the slides along. So just wait a second so I don't skip ahead. There we go. No, that's gone backwards. Try that again.
I've just clicked it, Rose.
Oh, yes, you're fighting with me here, Anne-Marie. Will you move it on one for me? That's it. Okay. So I suppose my point is that payroll in small businesses shouldn't be so complicated that it has to be outsourced. You know, a lot of the bigger companies can manage this, and we'll go on to talk about this in a moment. We're talking about permanent establishment and how I've advised some companies to how they can manage it. But it's not just work from home employees who are subject to this dual payroll. As I mentioned, you have the people who maybe have to visit customers or clients, or maybe do deliveries outside of the border, and where their duties are split either side of the border, then the dual payroll requirement exists there as well. It's not just the work from home, although today's session is mainly about work from home. And when I was looking into this, there's something that struck me, and I've mentioned this to the Department of Finance before when I've been talking to some people there in relation to this, is that the UK define a work day for the statutory residence test as a day where there's more than 3 hours of work in the UK. And if there's a cross-border trip, for example, that the employee starts in the UK where they haven't worked, say, up to 3 hours at that point, it's less than 3 hours, that's still counted as a UK workday. So they're very defined there as to how they establish what is a workday and what's not. But the equivalent rules south of the border, in the residency rules, they say that, you know, a day of residence is a day where any part of the day is spent by the individual in the state. And they define a work day as a day during which any part of which an individual performs work in the state. So that essentially means that a single phone call could be work in the state. And I would think, wouldn't it be nice if the actual definitions lined up by the side of the border? You know, that a suggestion would be maybe a 3 hour work rule could eliminate a whole cohort of workers from this dual payroll requirement. You know, because you think about situations where somebody, their duties are sort of split, they're visiting clients either side of the border, you know, they might only spend 3 hours or less than 3 hours on one side of the border. So that eliminates a day in terms of running the dual payroll for that day. What about the ones who just lift the laptop and go home and do a few hours at home? You know, that could eliminate all of those. So there's situations where a little small tweak, maybe as a suggestion, could help an awful lot of workers in this situation. Will you move me along again, Anne-Marie, please? Okay, so as well as dual payroll, what are the other blocks or risks that the employers are highlighting? Well, I've gotten an awful lot of these cases crossing my desk over the last number of years, particularly since the COVID relaxations went. With a huge number of people who are now working from home, working remotely from the employer, or applying for jobs where that is an option. And most employers now, in order to recruit, are having to offer flexibility and remote working as an option in order to recruit. But then the discrimination starts kicking in. And some people, even in recent days, have gone the whole way through a recruitment process right to the end, and they're the chosen candidate. And they say, uh-oh, you live the other side of the border. Sorry, we can't have you working remotely 4 days a week. And the blockers are put up. And so the blockers that are put up are all sorts of things, which Martin and Anne-Marie are going to go into some of them as well. But you've got all sorts of things around pensions and pension contributions, entitlement state pension, other things like, you know, regulatory issues. You know, you might have to have dual regulation either side of the border. Even in my own business, for example, we set up a Northern Ireland subsidiary because of Brexit. On the northern side of the border, and the reason for that was because we got two different sets of regulations in my own profession, and that was a way to manage it. And now we're able to employ the Northern Ireland employees in one company and the Southern employees in the other company, and that's okay for us, but it wouldn't work for everybody. But the main risk and the main blocker that's been put up by employers as to why they're preventing or saying we're developing a policy where you can't work on the other side of the border remotely for us is the PE risk, or permanent establishment risk. Now, I'll explain what that is. PE is permanent establishment of the employer company. So say you've got a company in the Republic of Ireland and it has a base or a branch in Northern Ireland. That's a permanent establishment. What does that base or branch do for that company? It creates a corporation tax exposure. In other words, they're going to have to pay some of their corporation tax north of the border. And what creates a permanent establishment then? Well, under the old rules, pre-2019, when there was some changes to the treaty, it used to be that you had to have a fixed place of business through which the business of the enterprise was wholly or partly carried on. Or you had what they called a dependent agent. You had somebody who was able to, negotiate and conclude contracts on your behalf on the other side of the border. And that created a corporation tax presence. You had to pay corporation tax there, and then you get credit for that corporation tax against the corporation tax in your home jurisdiction. But the treaty was widened, the PE part of the treaty, or the permanent establishment article, was widened back in 2019 with all the BEPS and base erosion stuff that's been going on in Europe. And basically what the rules now say is that there's a much wider scope of having a permanent establishment than there was previously. So now you just don't look at whether somebody has a fixed base or a permanent establishment. They say, well, what exactly is a fixed base of the company? Could the employee's home be a fixed base of the company? There's other things I've got to look at as well, is that they don't just look at one individual and what their authority is and what their role is in the business. They need to look at the entire picture. All of the employees of that employer that are in, say, for example, in this example, Northern Ireland, and all of the employees of connected companies in that group that are in Northern Ireland. So if you look at the whole picture, is it a cohesive business operation that's being carried on in Northern Ireland? If so, they've got a corporation tax risk. And I suppose because of these rules, companies are putting up a blocker saying, no, we can't have you work on the other side of the border. And they've got good reason for that, that there is a risk there. I mean, there's been some case law already. I think there's a case, think of that in Denmark, and an employee who was working from home did constitute a permanent establishment of its employer company, which is in another jurisdiction. And the reason for that was that they were generating business for the group. And even though the business wasn't actually, revenues in Denmark, it was creating profit, if you like, for the group elsewhere. So it was held in that case that they were creating a permanent establishment. So depending on the role or the nature of the business, the role of the employee or the nature of the business being carried on, they could create a PE of the company. So say, for example, a work from home contract of employment, it could create a PE of the UK company in the ROI, so therefore it's corporation tax exposure. So say it does, the UK company then has an ROI branch. So it has to pay corporation tax south of the border at the 12.5% rate. Under UK rules, there is what's called a foreign branch exemption clause, and some companies can claim that. And so in other words, they don't pay corporation tax on that part of their profits in the UK, they'd only pay it in Ireland. So that works very advantageously for UK companies with employees working across the border in the Republic of Ireland. And I've advised some businesses in relation to this. But then you go the other way around. Say you've got an ROI company and they've got employees working in Northern Ireland. So they've created like potentially a UK branch. There's no branch exemption under Irish rules. So essentially they've got exposure to potentially 19% or 25%, depending on the size of the business, corporation tax north of the border. And so that's definitely a tax cost to them. And so I think this area needs to be looked at as well in line with the employer rules. Can you move me on again, Anne-Marie, please? No, down. So what you'd have to try and do is to minimize the profits that you're leaving in the other jurisdiction, in the work from home jurisdiction, but do that legitimately. I mean, there's all sorts of things going on out there at the moment, because I've heard it back from lots of employees and some employers as well, as to how they're getting around the rules when doing things maybe they shouldn't be doing. They should not letting on that somebody's working remotely. There's obviously insurance issues there. There's maybe somebody working behind a VPN. Again, if they're working from home behind a VPN, it just doesn't mightn't show up that they're working remotely. But again, there's all sorts of regulatory and insurance issues. So we're trying to do things legitimately. What you could do is you could restrict the authority of the work from home employees. So you maybe only allow certain roles to work from home on the opposite side of the border. So people who don't have the authority, say, for example, to conclude contracts or generate a lot of business for the organization. You could do similar to what our own business did, but we did it for Brexit reasons, set up an entity in the other jurisdiction to employ the individuals who are working from home. So for example, if you've got an ROI company and it's got NI employees, you set up a Northern Ireland subsidiary, and you employ the Northern Ireland resident employees in that subsidiary, and they're then under UK employment contracts, which is other ramifications which Anne-Marie and Martin are going to go into, but they're now under a UK employment contract, which means is that they can work away from home if they need to. They can also use the normal treaty rules, the 60-day rules for the posted workers, and come into the ROI business or ROI office or premises for up to 60 days a year without any ROI payroll obligations. And then you say, well, how is this company going to be funded? Like, how are these employees going to be paid? Well, if they're not actually billing customers themselves and, you know, bringing in money as a subsidiary directly from their customer base, then there would have to be an intercompany pricing arrangement between the head office in the Republic of Ireland and the Northern Ireland subsidiary, and transfer pricing rules need to be complied with then. So this isn't the solution for everybody, but bigger companies can get into this, and even medium-sized ones. And bearing in mind that these rules are applicable no matter what size of business you are, then you know you can get into that and you can manage it. So, for example, if you've got an Irish group limited, it is NI resident employees who want to work full-time or part-time from home. You set up the subsidiary, they're now under UK employment contracts in that company, and their normal place of work is the Northern Ireland base or Northern Ireland office. So they can work from home full-time or part-time, and can attend the ROI office occasionally as well without any further payroll obligations, but so as to keep under the 60 days. You'd recharge the costs of that NI subsidiary to the Irish group under the transfer pricing rules, but say beware of all the other ramifications of this, which Martin and Anne-Marie are going to go into. Is there another one there, Anne-Marie, please? I sound like great. What do you call your fellow who used to do the Late Late Show for years? Roll it on there, Colette. The other jurisdictions then, yeah, that we've looked at other jurisdictions, and you know, what are other people doing in other jurisdictions along land borders? And a couple of things I was thinking about, and I'm going to make a suggestion, is that some of the jurisdictions looked at buffer zones. So along the border, the land border itself, for example, it could be the border counties, or it could be the whole of Northern Ireland or whatever. That would be a buffer zone where the workers within that buffer zone are treated slightly differently. They're treated as not having crossed the border, if you like, in some of the jurisdictions. And Anne-Marie's going to mention some of these later. And I was also looking at the wording in our own treaty between Ireland and the UK, the Article 18 wording. And what it says, it refers to individuals who are a national of that state or did not become a resident of that state solely for the purpose of rendering the services. So I was thinking, could we use some of this type of language to try and find a solution to the PE risk? You know, if the NI or border counties were a buffer zone for work from home employees, you could have a work from home employee who's resident in Northern Ireland and employed by an ROI employer, but is not considered to be carrying out duties in Northern Ireland, and therefore not creating a PE risk while they're working from home in the buffer zone, if they're a national or a citizen of Northern Ireland and didn't become resident in Northern Ireland solely for the purpose of carrying out the duties. They just happen to live there. I mean, it's a suggestion. That's what I suppose today is all about, is trying to open the conversation to see if there's ways of coming up with solutions to this. And that's something that crossed my mind. So I thought I'll throw it out there as a suggestion. And it was a mixture of people on the programme today, so it'd be interesting what other people's views on this are. I think that might be the last of the current ones for me, Anne-Marie. It's back to you or Martin. Yeah.
That's brilliant, Rose. Thanks so much. I don't know how you got through all that in such a short period of time.
Talk too fast.
Talk really fast. That's a good one. Look, Martin, we're going to pass over to you now. We've got a couple of really good examples. Some of the things that we've been talking about that keep popping up, and I think making all of this real, putting a few scenarios around it, I think kind of helps us to kind of grasp the realities of all the things that Rose just went through. You know, that's so complicated. But what does Joe Bloggs, you know, what's the reality for him at home? Well, in this scenario, it's Jimmy and Deirdre. So I'll pass over to you, Martin.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. Thanks, Rose. That was brilliant. Yeah, I'm going to sort of probably bring it right down now to the employee level of what impacts the per unfortunate employee in this. And I suppose I'll open with saying that from an employee's perspective, normally the working from home and the change in contracts and all these changes come about when there are kind of maybe 40 or 50 employees are brought into the Zoom meeting or invited back into the office, and there's a discussion about the fact that the company needs to make changes because they're not maybe tax compliant or social insurance compliant and that. And the company, from their point of view, they'll have got advice from the legal advisors, accountants like Rose here, from the HR experts, and maybe from government departments as well, of what the implications are for them in these situations. And they'll come to employees very much from the point of view of the company and what's right for the company, and which is totally correct and right. The problem is that if you have 40 employees in a room and they've been kind of told generally what's going to happen and sort of generalizing about, well, we're going to move it to UK contract, you'll be starting from in the south of Ireland from such a date, or the north of Ireland, whichever way. And they're kind of given a very general rundown of what will happen. They're asked to sign a new contract, and they can maybe consider it for a week or to go and look for some advice on that. And most employees are really, they're POE, they're in a company, their taxes are sorted out, their national insurance or PSI is sorted out, they're paying their bills, they're tax compliant, they're just doing their job to maybe as best they can, and they're not really that overly concerned about the outside issues because they don't think it relates to them. Everything's kind of taken care of. So the issue arises then that when it gets down to that individual and what happens to the individual when all this change comes about. And these here examples will hopefully give you a good highlight to everybody of the impacts. So we have Jimmy and Deirdre. Jimmy and Deirdre is happily married, working in the south. They're living in Derry. Jimmy's company's downsized and he's now basically working from home. So he had been earning €23,000. He's now on the sterling equivalent. So a bit of a deal done to say, right, here's what we give you in sterling. But the issue really still arises for Deirdre. Deirdre's a very high earner in the south and was using the married couples allowance because both their incomes were in the Republic of Ireland and no income in the UK. So they're entitled to the married couples allowance in the Republic. And it was given Deirdre £300 a month extra in her she's paying 300 less in tax each month. Also within this, they were getting their child benefit in full from the Republic of Ireland because both of them were paying their PSI in the Republic of Ireland. But what happened in this situation was that Deirdre went to apply for a small amount of tax relief from the revenue, and the revenue had asked then to proof of worldwide income, which is the very normal thing to do from HMRC. And when these letters were produced, it was seen that Jimmy had income now in the UK and no income in the Republic of Ireland. So what had to happen there was that the married couples allowance wasn't going to be available now. Deirdre had to be taxed as a single person. And so she then ended up with a tax bill in the Republic of Ireland because the revenue had to go back and change her tax status because Jimmy now was earning sterling. So because their situation wasn't looked at the time or checked out as a family, it first of all caused a tax bill of €4,600. Deirdre contacted the child benefit. Child benefit said, no, you're not entitled to full child benefit from the Republic of Ireland because you now have earnings in the UK, and said you need to go to the UK first of all and we'll pay a supplementary payment. So she ended up in arrears in child benefit, having to pay it back and getting a reduced amount of child benefit from the Republic. She had no entitlement in the UK because her earnings were over the 60,000 means tested levels for the UK. She had a claim that she would have had to pay it all back in tax. So for a simple thing where Jimmy was earning the least of the two, changing over, working from home, had a huge effect on their finances. And I think it's probably typical, certainly in where you have the two employees working in the same jurisdiction, and certainly from the revenue point of view, they're fit to share their tax credits. So that's the first example, very quick, just to give you an idea of the impact. So extra tax bill and child benefit costs. Second one is slightly different. We have Peter here, lives up in Antrim. Good hurlers, no footballers, unfortunately for them. And he's working down in Drogheda, has been for a long time. And there was a change again in this situation where in 2020, he was changed to 3 days at home and 2 days in the office, which was correct and right again. He was working from home those days and the company was making sure they were tax compliant. The payroll was run in both jurisdictions. He's now earning 30,000 sterling because that's his 3 days in the north. He had been on €36,000 previously for that, and 24,000 for the extra 2 days. So it came to his attention, first of all, when he went to pay 10,000 as his pension, and he had typically been doing this and getting his 40% tax relief. When he tried to do this, of course, he now isn't a 40% taxpayer in the Republic of Ireland because he's only earning 24,000 in it. And his joint tax together, when he does a tax return in the UK, has him still at just on the edge for 20%. So he was kind of annoyed that he was losing 20% tax on this, so he's losing 2,000 tax relief. But at the same time, we were saying, well, there's a balance in this because, of course, you're not paying 40% tax now. Now, the second part of this here was that the Section 1032 relief came into play, and this is where somebody who is non-resident in the Republic of Ireland, somebody living in the north. So for Peter up in Antrim, he had received his full tax credits and allowances in the Republic of Ireland as an employee, as normal, thinking, yep, perfectly okay, because all his earnings were in the Republic of Ireland. But under the regulations, under Section 452 of this, if 75% or more of your income is earned in the Republic of Ireland, you're entitled to those extra credits. If less than that is in the Republic of Ireland, then you're not entitled to them, and there is then a reduction in the tax credits. And this has meant that now that Peter's earned 30,000 in the north, the balance is that he's earning a lot more in the north than he is in the south. So revenue have then reduced his tax credits, and he's ended up with a tax bill to the Republic of Ireland because he doesn't satisfy the 75% rate. And again, from Peter's point of view, he went into a room to look at this situation, was told by his employer how they would match up his salary and everything would work out much the same as it was. And it was very much on the sort of a gross pay basis and not looked at from the minute detail of that actual person or how it affects the balance between the two countries. So as you can imagine, whenever Peter and myself had our discussions and explained all that was happening, he was, to say the least, quite annoyed about this and frustrated that there wasn't the level of advice given whenever he was looking to make the decision to do this. And he felt that if the option was back to 5 days a week in Drogheda, he would have looked maybe at that and stayed in the position he was in. So I think a good second example of the potential issues with cross-border tax, with the implications of earning in two jurisdictions. Now, on the sort of, just sort of flying through a few examples here for you to give you a rundown. There's a few areas that when we look at these situations, we look at from the individual, and we look to see if it's a single person, there's a big difference in that to somebody who is a single parent and maybe a widowed parent. If somebody has an incapacitated child at home, there's very generous and decent tax credits in the Republic of Ireland. And if somebody is changing to a work from home and are receiving any of these credits, they will be severely impacted when they go into the UK system, because the UK system doesn't allow for a lot of extra credits and allowances. So the allowances, if you're just looking purely on gross wages and matching up on maybe a 60,000 euro salary, and we're agreeing we'll give you X amount in sterling, and it kind of matches round, it's the actual take home can be seriously impacted. And that then has ramifications both sides of the border for what your entitlement is on either side. So I think from that quick rundown, just to kind of give you a good idea of where we are.
That's brilliant, Martin. Thanks so much. We did have some questions submitted at the registration time, which was really, really handy for us, because we hope that we're weaving the answers throughout this presentation now today. And I think those examples in particular, I think answered some of the questions that did come in. They were quite close, some of them, those cases, Martin, that you mentioned. So that's great. So now we've looked at tax, but as I mentioned beforehand, it's social insurance is the next thing then that we ask people, to consider. And, whenever we talk about social insurance, what do we mean? People go, social insurance, never heard of it. So that's your PRSI and our national insurance contributions. And then what does that mean, for a person then? So I'm paying social insurance. So we're going to pay that. For a cross-border worker, the rules mean that a person will only ever be obliged to pay into one system at a time. Now, top-ups can be paid in voluntary contributions. That's a different conversation, but they're only actually obliged to pay into one system. And then that system is supposed to protect them and look after them should they need assistance. And that's the whole point of it. And the coordination rules mean that for many of the individuals that I come across, they might have a job dotted across the border, back and forward throughout their working lifetime. So they have records built up at different periods of time in both jurisdictions and in other places too. So the coordination rules mean that should that person need to gather them all together in order to qualify for a benefit, the rules will let them do that. So when we're thinking about benefits, what are we talking about? So we're thinking, if we think of a cross-border worker then, an illness benefit then for that person who's too ill to go to work, where do they, you know, their question to us would be, where do I get illness benefit? I'm too ill to go to work. So we'd say the place you were last insured. Right? Do you pay PRSI? Do you pay national insurance? That's where you start. And then, as I say, you know, we do explain to them, then they can combine social insurance contributions in both jurisdictions. Now, in the cross-border cases, it's those benefits that are linked to contributions that cross borders. Okay, the means tested benefits don't tend to cross borders, and so you can bear that one in mind. So the others from cross-border workers, you know, they tend to ask about illness benefit, maternity benefit, family benefits, and they're a little bit different on each side of the border. And pensions. So we all talk about the place that you were last insured, you know, whenever they're looking at these pensions. Unemployment benefit, that is usually if the person is made completely and utterly unemployed, they will actually claim at home rather than the place of employment. If they're temporarily made unemployed, they will they'll still have that connection to the place of work, so they'll claim there. So the unemployment benefit stands out a little bit differently. But the others, it's usually the place where they were last insured, so the place of work. And then the pensions, they might apply in the place of residence, but they're going to talk about their employment in the other jurisdiction. So that's what's relevant for them to get their pension. So that's all very straightforward. If you remembered a few slides back, whenever I introduced, it was very straightforward whenever the person is either completely full-time crossing the border every day to work, or they were full-time working at home. So they know which system they're part of. It's the hybrid patterns now that are really becoming complicated for people. So the basic rule is, and I've taken this from the European Commission website, the basic rule is that if you work in more than one EU country, but you carry out a substantial part of your professional activities in your country of residence, that's where you're insured. That is who is responsible for you. So the tricky word in there, substantial. What is substantial? So it mentions there at least 25% of your time or your income. If that is spent at home, that's the jurisdiction that's going to be most likely responsible for you. And that particular slide gives other issues that the authorities will consider whenever they're deciding. So it's not up to the person to decide where they're going to pay. The authorities behind the scene will make that decision for them. And it's this hybrid nature of the hybrid patterns that are causing complexities now. And it's the following cases now that Martin has that's really going to drive this home, the impact, the unintended consequences of working from home and the knock-on effect that can have then on a person's social security payments. Over to you, Martin.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. Yes, this is the tax was nearly simple. This is where it gets very tricky. We're going to start off with a case study that has a lot of impact. This is a genuine case study that had a lot of impact, and one of the biggest reasons it had an impact was because of the lack of information that was really given again to the employees at the time to what was happening. And this is Annie. Annie's married to Albert, works in the dock. Albert worked in Uri. They're living in Drummondtee in County Armagh, and they're married and 4 children. They get their child benefit supplementary payment in the Republic of Ireland, with Annie working in the Republic, but nothing in the North because they're over the earnings threshold. And Annie changed her hybrid pattern 11 months ago and works from home 3 days a week. This was the company wanted, and it suited to keep everything in correct regulations. Payroll has said she pay her still in euro and paid into her Dundalk bank account, and that they run a shadow payroll and basically they take care of everything. And it was left at that. She said that's okay. She was told to do a self-assessment, which is perfectly normal in the UK, and that this would balance off any tax owed at the end of the year. Now, Annie is due a baby 2 months' time and completed her MB1 form in the Republic of Ireland. Department of Social Protection replied to her and said that she's not entitled to maternity benefit, quite rightly so, because she's now not paying PRSI, and advised her to contact the UK Social Security offices. The this was a serious gunk to her because she hadn't realised that there was any change in PRSI. Her pay slip, and totally part employee responsibility. She had just looked at her pay slip, passed no remarks. As long as the money was balanced at the bottom like before, she was happy enough. She called a payroll and they said, yep, you've been contributing to the national insurance contributions from, we changed you over 11 months ago, and there's no PRSI been paid. Because the hybrid working pattern meant that the liability was in the UK for national insurance. And that was correct and right. So, as you can imagine, 2 months ago to having a baby, she is now very frantic and very annoyed. And I think there's something to point out here, that the issue isn't what amount of money you get from either side, or what actual, am I better off getting a UK benefit or a Republic of Ireland benefit. The issue here is now that this lady was put completely up to high dough and has no idea where to turn to, and has found herself in a situation that she didn't realize was going to happen, and only by accident kind of fell into it when she went to sort out. And as I say, she's 4 children, she was doing the same thing every time, and there was no change in anything, and she hadn't thought that this was going to happen and hadn't been given the proper guidance, I think. And if at the time when they were again all brought into the Zoom meeting, if the proper guidance was there and the proper advice given for the employees, they could decide whether to go back to the office and not want to do a work from home. They could decide, okay, I can plan from here. She was now having to liaise with the Social Security offices in the north. She hadn't been there in years. Their record for her then had a very, very small amount of national insurance contribution. So she had found very much to her dissatisfaction. She had no entitlement in the Republic of Ireland now because she wasn't paying her PRSI there. Her entitlement was in the north, but her stamp was very low in the north. So she was having now to deal with, to her, was a complete foreign system. And when she contacted the Social Security offices, they really didn't know how to operate this either, because going, you don't have a stamp, why would you be entitled in here? So she had to come and seek advice and talk to us to see what had to happen to make sure that she was entitled to something. Now, the benefit structure in the UK, of course, is a totally different one for your maternity benefit. And it's a percentage of your salary for so many weeks. It's 6 weeks, and then it drops down to either 150 or 90% of your salary, and it runs for 39 weeks. In the Republic, it's 26 weeks, and it's on a financial amount of money that you're paid. So 2 different setups, 2 different sets of schemes, but also from the employer, there are 2 different sets of rules, even when you'd expect to have Annie coming back to work. So everything to her was thrown totally haywire over this situation. What then happened was that, again, a wee bit like in some of our last examples, Annie realised, well, I've got to contact child benefit. She'd signed her forms that would come out to say, has your circumstances changed? And on her form, she said no, she's still working for the same employer. She was still earning, as far as she was concerned, in the Republic of Ireland. But what had happened was, for 11 months now, she had been paying child benefit that she wasn't entitled to. And child benefit, we're saying, well, look at from this start that you need now to repay us from you starting to pay national insurance. So we now have a mum sitting with a lot of serious issues, and to her, it all came back to not being told at the time what the reality of this was. She would have stayed in the contract in the Republic of Ireland if she had been given the proper advice. And when her baby was born and she went back after maternity, potentially then shifted into a UK contract when it was going to be more straightforward for her. So I think on this example, it kind of gives a real normal situation. Somebody who was just planning to go off maternity, have her time off, have her baby, and come back to work in her normal pattern, and had no realization that this was happening. From the employer's point of view, they readily admitted when we spoke to them that they didn't realize all this was impacting either. They didn't see that this was happening and that these situations were arising. So I think it's a very, very, very good example of something that can happen on either side of the border. It doesn't matter whether you're moving from a company in Newry and living in the dock, or from the dock to Newry. It's the exact same example. It's the implications on either side. And again, as well as that, it's also the you're falling into completely different rules. and completely different regulations. And it's very difficult from the department's point of view to kind of get this all corrected. And I think what has been happening is that a lot of larger employers are kind of looking at these situations from their own side. They're moving maybe 100 of a workforce into UK contracts, for example, or into Republic of Ireland contracts, and not looking at the implications on departments of social protection, of child benefit, of anything else that's there that impacts. And the companies are keeping themselves correct and right by doing it, but there's an awful lot of people then out there having to do a lot of work to kind of get everything rectified behind the scenes within all the different, between government departments, between advisors, between community groups, between the likes of citizen information, are all having to try and tidy it all up behind the scenes. So I think this was a very, very good example. Okay, we'll move on from the babies and the child benefit. We'll go to the other side of it. This is Mary. Mary lives in Oma, and she's worked in Lifford. So we're looking here from an example of state pension, and we're looking at it that, as I say, she worked in Lifford for 34 years. So she's from the north of Ireland, working in the south of Ireland, and she had left school and finished her in the north. She basically went and has worked continually in the Republic of Ireland. And again, this was a smaller company that was more trying to, be decent and be good, and trying to, do something that would keep Mary right, that you could work away and not have to be traveling. It was more just trying to make a situation better. So they had said, right, we'll move you to the north. You want to work from home, and it's suiting to work from home rather than having to drive all the time. They switched her to a UK salary and give her a good, decent UK salary as well. The company was been very good, and just paying her UK tax and national insurance contributions. Mary came to us in the situation that somebody had mentioned to her about her state pension and her contributions and what would happen. And what she hadn't thought about was that she was intending to retire within about 8 years. She had 34 years contributions in the Republic of Ireland. She had no contributions in the north of Ireland. And the issues that arose here is that it changes then how her pension is calculated, what she's entitled to. When the calculation will be done in the Republic of Ireland, it will be based on her contributions from she was 16 till whenever she retires. It can be looked at from either the averaging rule or from the total contributions. And by not finishing off and continuing on in the Republic of Ireland, she now will have a situation where there is going to be contributions of national insurance in the north of Ireland and contributions from the Republic of Ireland. And she's concerned now that this here could actually have an effect on her that would reduce the pension that she would have been entitled to when she would retire. And we've done some calculations just to get an idea of it. And there is potentially a loss for Mary because of this. So it's a situation where again, the contributions, your PRSI or your national insurance, either side of the ball again, it's vital to work out before you make a change of that, what is going to impact. So somebody that's closer to retirement, there's a big impact on your contributions and where the majority of them have been. And certainly as well as that, if a situation arose where redundancy, for example, was a raise for Mary and she was still in Lifford, the long service can actually be very good for her from a redundancy point of view and one of the options. So there's different things there that she's losing out on by working from home and going into the UK side. So that's a kind of a very brief one on that. It's something to watch out for, certainly the state pension and how it works. I'll keep going here to keep this kind of, I'm thinking that you're going to get an easy time of it. This is a totally different one again. This here woman, this is the healthcare side of life, and that's what Anne-Marie spoke about earlier. And this is Ellen. Ellen lives in Cavan, and Ellen has worked in Enniskillen for 20 years, driving over and back, commuting, but she had taken ill health. And the company, again, very good and very decent, said, look, we want to keep you on. If you work from home, we'll change our contracts and that to make sure we're all tax compliant and everything's done right. And change the contract round and give her an Irish contract, agreed her wages, on that. And she was delighted with this because she wasn't having to travel, and her health meant that she could work, but she wasn't fit for the commute. So it was a very much an act of decency on the company again, no issue at all from that. So she's now paying her Irish taxes, paying PRSI, and now earning euro, and happy enough, always going well, because she lives in Cavan, she was earning her euro, she didn't have to start changing money or anything anymore, everything was grand. What happened then was that her medical card, as Anne-Marie had alluded to earlier, she was entitled to it in the Republic of Ireland up to this, with no means test. And so she was using her doctor in the Republic of Ireland, and she had our access there. She also had access to the NHS in the UK, because if you're an employee in the north of Ireland, live in the south of Ireland, you can access the NHS, the same as if you live in the north of Ireland. So you'd open access to the NHS. And this had been great because she had been ill health, and she had been continually using Enniskillen Hospital and using the consultants and that there. So had no idea that this here was going to impact. And it came about then that she got notification to say that she had no medical card now in the Republic of Ireland, and was quite angry at this and going, what's happened, or why is this? Because again, employees tend to just work on the system that they have, that it's a routine, and they weren't considering the change in the tax situation as going to affect anything else outside of that. She then had notification then too to say that she wasn't entitled to her NHS because she was no longer working in the UK. So a simple change to her from a company just trying to get her into a good situation that was good for her health impacted that she lost the benefits of being a frontier worker and living south and working north. And I think from this point of view, it highlights that when somebody isn't well and you're trying to do the best for them, sometimes you have to look a bit further to see, is there implications of that? And this certainly was a situation that really did cause a lot of concern, a lot of worry. And that was poor Ellen, unfortunately. Now I think is that. No.
That's your examples for the moment.
Good. Yeah.
Well done. I think those examples really help to bring the policy to life, doesn't it? You know, how these policies are actually impacting on the ground. And it frequently is the sad cases that kind of come across our table, and the people really, really do need help to get themselves onto the right path. Frequently in both tax and with the social insurance questions that come across our table, you know, we are encountering people who mostly had no idea of what it was that they were missing out on, thought that they were paying everything that they should be in the place that they should be, and are really keep being kept awake at night whenever they realize that something wasn't quite right. So I think it's really, really important to get as much of this information out there before people go too far down the wrong road. You know, it's much better to help them before things go wrong at the start of a cross-border job, get them on the right path, and they're flying through the red tape, the likes of Rose and Martin with their expertise. The things we think are complicated are not complicated at all for them, or not as complicated at all. But, you know, with the right knowledge and pointing them in the right direction at the very beginning is absolutely priceless. And I think, you know, we need to get more and more awareness of these issues. Now, there are other issues as well that have been cropping up. It's not just tax and social insurance. It's also going to be, we're going to take a break now, but I want to tell you what's happening afterwards. We're going to have a look at the impact then on private medical health schemes, on income protection policy, on the financial impact for a person that's been looking at a mortgage and they've entered into a hybrid working pattern, and then things just to be aware of, perhaps if redundancies coming down the line. Now, there's also issues that are cropping up as well with employment law type scenarios and with contracts, and we think we're going to actually have to do a separate shorter session on just that, because it's so complicated. that we thought we're going to just step away from that for the moment. But these are the things I suppose to be aware of whenever you're renegotiating that package, if there is talk about a payroll into the other jurisdiction. But before Martin takes us through these great case studies, we're going to take a 5-minute break. So if you go and stretch your legs 4 or 5 minutes and meet us back here. So it's almost 10 past. So it'll be 1:15. We're going to start promptly because we're running a little bit over. So come back in 5 or 6 minutes. Thanks. Okay, so we are flying through this information and there is an awful lot being thrown at you. So please don't forget that I mentioned earlier on that we will have a briefing paper that's going to be circulated to everyone on this call today. That'll be available in a couple of days' time with just some other wee tweaks just to add in some thoughts that are popping into our heads now after this conversation on this. This call is really, really valuable. So the issues now, the other things beyond tax and social insurance and the healthcare bit, the other things that are popping up, as I mentioned, are income protection, found to be unsuitable for incomes earned on 2 payrolls in 2 different jurisdictions. Medicals, problem with private medical insurance, the impact on loans and mortgages, and then also the implications for those of us facing a redundancy situation, which is really really complicated at times on a cross-border basis, particularly if there's hybrid working. So Martin has selected a couple of really good case studies that set some of this out. So Martin, I'll quickly jump over to you there. I'm just conscious of time now. We're doing okay, but these case studies are brilliant. So you take your time and go through these, it'd be great.
And thank you, Anne-Marie. Right, this is Aaron. Yeah, we're now looking at it from a different point of view altogether, I suppose, from wanting to get a mortgage and looking at it from that. I'll explain a bit about Erin. She was employed in Dublin, lives in Armagh, working from home 2 days a week, and applied for a mortgage in the north of Ireland. Ursula was her mortgage advisor, great mortgage advisor she is, and said it was a limited market and many mortgage companies wouldn't accept euro income. And this reflects both sides of the border. It's very difficult for somebody living in the north of Ireland to get a mortgage in the south of Ireland. For a property, it's very difficult for somebody south of Ireland to buy in the north of Ireland. And when you're a cross-border frontier worker, it's very difficult as well. So that there's limitations everywhere when it comes to wanting to buy your home. And what happened was that Ursula, the mortgage advisor, found her a mortgage company that would accept euro income, and everything was fine. She had produced her pay slips or P60s on that, and everything stacked up, and there was what they call agreement in principle for the mortgage. For a few months passed when all the legal work was complete and when everything was being done, and in this time, Erin changed over from the full income coming from the Republic of Ireland and everything in euro to now being on the hybrid model. So the issue was now that the mortgage company wanted to see up-to-date pay slips to see her situation. She passed no remarks in this, sent off her information. Her income was exactly as it was before. She wasn't earning anything less. Her issue was now that because of the payroll system, she was earning sterling and earning euro, and had 2 different pay slips, 2 jurisdictions, and 2 currencies. And with this hybrid pattern, the mortgage company basically took a look at this and could not make head nor tail of any of it, to be quite honest. They went, what is going on here? Because the mortgage companies are sitting in the UK, and they have no idea about this world, why anybody would leave one country to go to work in another one for a few days a week. It was totally bizarre to them. They looked at their lending criteria and they looked at everything they had and got back to say that they could not accept her now for a mortgage because this was totally outside of their criteria. They were happy in lending in euro for 100% of their income coming from euro on this job, But they were looking at now from their own point of view of security, and from the point of view, well, if we lend you the money, can we 100% say that you can repay it based on your new circumstances? And so from their point of view, they said no, and they withdrew the mortgage offer. And like anybody who I'm sure has applied for a mortgage, Erin was gutted in this situation. And when Ursula looked to see any other mortgage companies or what was available, she couldn't find a mortgage that would work in this circumstance for her. So it's a simple scenario. And again, when a mortgage is applied for, a company, when they agree it on your circumstances at that time. So in this instance, if Erin had taken the mortgage out when she was still on a full payroll in Dublin, 5 days a week, one income in euro, that would have been fine. If she had to switch to a hybrid a month later, the mortgage company would say that's fine from their regard, because they've based their judgment on the situation before they give you the money. So to them, they would have been okay with that. But once this change happened, that changed it completely from their point of view. So again, it was something that happened that she wasn't looking at particularly, that was going to be an issue to anybody, and it came back basically to cause a huge issue. And part of the problem there too is it's not something you can't just then turn around and go back and say, oh, I'll go back and work 5 days a week in Dublin to change this. It does with the likes of mortgages and that, it doesn't happen like that. You can't just change something back and it automatically be okay again, because the mortgage company will then be looking to say, well, why did you change back and what's happening? And the chances are, if you went back to them in 6 months' time and had your full income in the Republic of Ireland, they still would refuse you the mortgage based on the fact that there was a change in employment. And they are so it's something from a mortgage point of view that I think is a serious concern in the hybrid systems, and maybe potentially because on both sides it's so new and they're not up to date with them or used to this idea that is causing these issues. But it's one to bear in mind. If anyone's in that situation, be wary. Right, is that quick enough? I'll do that nice and quick and tidy. This then is back to health, but it's back to employee benefits within your payslip. So several companies will have good employee benefit schemes in place, be it in the north or be it in the south. And with these, they are part of either it could be a pension as percentage of earnings, it could be an income protection scheme, and an income protection scheme is designed to pay, in the Republic of Ireland, for example, it could be up to 75% of your earnings. Once your sick pay stops, your work sick pay stops, it will cut in and start to pay you up to your retirement age. So very, very good. The private medical insurance schemes then would be the likes of your VHIs or your DAs, and they'll provide the medical care if anything happens. But they're designed very much in the jurisdiction that you're in. If you're in the UK, the schemes work slightly differently and the percentages will work slightly differently. But the issue here has arisen, and I'll explain it here for David. And so he's living in Armagh, he's employed in Monaghan. And again, it was COVID and working from home that they changed the contract. And again, perfectly okay to do that as far as the company was the right thing to do, because he was working from home. But his health had deteriorated when he started working with the company in Monaghan, and he has diabetes. So diabetes from a medical point of view, I'm also here a bit of a doctor as well, and all this carry on. So when we speak to the insurance companies, we mention diabetes, they have serious concerns about cover. And the reason is that diabetes can affect so many different parts of your body that it's very difficult to cover you with diabetes, because you could affect your eyes or your feet or that. So from David's point of view, when he changed over and then went to put in place an income protection scheme and a private medical insurance scheme, the UK company from the income protection said first they couldn't cover him at all. And they couldn't cover him because the diabetes would affect so many areas of his body. They couldn't give him any cover. So from his side of things, diabetes was going to have an effect on him forever. and the changeover from the old contract, it had stopped. So he was now back in the north and had no cover in place, and wouldn't be fit to get cover either through his own company scheme or through the personal companies. Will give him no cover. And the private medical insurance scheme had looked at it as well and said, well, we can't give you any cover relating to diabetes. Potentially with cover for other areas, but not for anything linked to diabetes. So this here move caused all the issues on a health situation, and again, very hard to go back and change that when you go to move back. So whenever we're looking at situations of somebody's health, you have to be very, very careful with your employee benefits, of what you're entitled and what's there, because it's some schemes will allow you in to them with if it's part of a big scheme, you may be entitled to join it without any health declarations. But most schemes and smaller employers and that, there'll be health declarations, or if there's any existing illnesses and that, you will have issues with it. So we had a serious issue with Per David on that. So I think that's enough for David. A quick piece on redundancy is not an area I would be in any way an expert on or know very much about. This needs legal advice and advice from so many areas. What we would be advising at the moment from an employee point of view is that they need to really look closely if they have a choice of staying in one jurisdiction or the other, and not moving into the hybrid or not moving completely to the work from home and moving contract, what the implications are around the redundancy. Because your redundancy from a statutory point of view will be based on you paying your social insurance in the country that you're in at the time, and how long you paid social insurance and how long you're in a contract. So for somebody, and we can go back, we talked about the lady who had 34 years working in Lifford. If she was made redundant in 3 or 4 years' time and she was in the UK, how much has she lost out on, or what was the company going to do there to protect what you would have had in place? So if an employer is looking at it from the point of view of wanting the employee to work from home, will they put in place something that would protect the redundancy that they would have been entitled to in that jurisdiction? So their own redundancy scheme. Because the worry is that when you would go to the statutory redundancy schemes in either country, they're going to be based on what you have there, or really you're wanting the employer to take maybe more responsibility and see what they're going to do to compensate it. And if it's a situation where maybe the employer ends up going bust, something happens, the company, it closes, where are you protected and what rights have you got? If you're back in the south of Ireland working and your employer was originally in the north, and now you've moved into the southern one, where are your rights? Where are you going to be protected, and what's going to happen in the future? So from an employee point of view, we would be very much stressing that they have to make sure that there is something in place there to protect them in the case of redundancy, and to really try and get good advice on that. And then from a taxation point of view, of course, there's going to be different taxations and different exemptions available north and south, depending on your situation as well. So I think it's something that maybe should be potentially looked at in the future, is the whole redundancy for hybrid workers and how it's affected them and what maybe should be put in place. So yeah, that's a wee bit on it. I think that's all my pieces for now.
It is indeed. Martin, thanks so much. I think for sure we'll have to come back to the redundancy bit and the discussions about changes to contracts and how to engage in that process as well. So we'll have for sure a shorter session on that topic. I'll gather up some experts and I'll share the details with you all. You can sign up for that. So we'll just move on. We've half an hour left. We might not need it all. We might, but we might not. There's a couple of slides here that I had for recap, going back over recapping payroll, recapping which jurisdiction is responsible depending on the hybrid models. But it would take too long. I think I'll include those in the briefing paper, and it just recaps everything that we've gone through in the last hour. What will also be included in the paper is a checklist, and this is the bones of it. So it's something that maybe an employee would have a think about, or an employer, if they're thinking about. Usually the conversation starts with just tax. And I suppose this, what we're trying to do is just get people to think beyond that, to think about the wider consequences, and sometimes the unintended consequences. You know, an employer could be doing the best for their employee and not realise the unintended consequences. So we put together a checklist, and that will be included in the briefing paper. But really, it just, I suppose, asks them to consider, you know, are they very rarely working from home? Is there a pattern? Are they full-time at home? Is there a pattern to set number of days per week at home and in the office? You know, just the things to, and if they tick these boxes whenever they would go to the likes of Martin and Rose, there's a lot of the story has been captured in that checklist then, that will help them to gather up the information, the advice then that they need going forward. The social security payments part is really, really important for a lot of individuals that are popping across the border back and forward. Some of those jobs really need that top up from the social security systems north and south. And sometimes, particularly with the cost of living issues that we're having at the moment, we're seeing people stuck, entitled, certainly entitled in the other jurisdiction whenever they move across. But what happens is there's a pause on a payment from the jurisdiction of employment, and then that is paused until the other jurisdiction, the jurisdiction of residence, all they assess their, you know, their responsibility for the person. So there might be a back payment, that's okay, but in the meantime there could be a huge cash flow issue that is, you know, could be coming down the line for that person. If they know what's coming, they can plan for it. It's the shocks and surprises, you know, that obviously they want to avoid. So that checklist will be part of the paper as well, and as I say, that will go out to you in a couple of days' time. So the next steps, I suppose, you know, the issues certainly from the Centre Cross-Border Studies point of view, and from our project Border People, you know, we're just looking at what we have at the moment and how to handle that. You know, the current situation is that there's the risk out there of employers not recruiting across the border because of that expectation now that people have that there will be some element of working from home provided for within a contract. There's a risk of workers not even considering the opportunities. A brilliant opportunity could be just across the border, and if they took a little bit of good advice, they could get them on the right path, and off they go with that great opportunity. So there's a risk of them missing out. There's a risk, and that we're seeing this a lot, of cross-border employees not being offered working from home opportunities as their other colleagues resident in the same place that their employer is based. So there's a bit of divergence there on opportunities within the workforce. We're very worried about contracts being changed without full consideration of the impacts. Sometimes misinformation is probably the kindest way to put some of the information that's been driven out from some of the larger employers that we know of, that are particularly sometimes misdirecting and giving a wee bit too much comfort to their employees to say, don't worry about it, off you go on the new contract. And then, of course, there's that with the current system, the employers, and sometimes very small employers, subject to the complications and the cost of running payrolls then in both jurisdictions. So what can we do? We can quickly, and we're trying to build as much awareness as we can with employers, but we need the authorities to step in there. How-to guides, support for small businesses. We need schemes that will really encourage cross-border workers and cross-border employers to be able to fully flourish in the border region, you know, to be able to grasp the opportunities and not to be put off by too much red tape. You know, so, and we also, you know, very much have to create that awareness that there's implications beyond tax, very, very much. So, you know, we're trying to do that as best we can with the project and within the advice sectors north and south. So looking into the future then, you know, as with everything, you know, the centre always talks about making sure that policies are border proofed, that they're regionally relevant, that they're tailored to suit real life experiences of living here. You know, so many people have a foot on each side of the border, and the policies that are driven out from departments should really reflect that. The holistic approach, absolutely. You know, we've talked about lots of things beyond tax. So, you know, we are really hopeful that there's good collaboration happening between the departments and between the jurisdictions. Now, whenever we look to what's happening in France and Switzerland, for example, when we look to the borders of other places, and lots of them, those borders are way more complicated than our own, in this example, this is a brilliant example, and it's one of was it a buffer zone that you mentioned earlier on, Rose? I think you mentioned it was a buffer zone. So the gist of this is that there's a provisional agreement based in and around the COVID time. So it was May 2020, and it reflected the need in that time. From January 23, then they've amended their bilaterals now to allow for teleworking, as it's known in the EU, post-COVID. So what it means for them is they have two distinct, they have two definitions. So there's a border worker and then there's a cross-border worker. And this is the buffer zone that Rose mentioned earlier. So in this scenario, French residents in very specific border locations in Switzerland can work in those locations. They're very specific, and they are treated as if they don't cross the border to go to work. They are only taxed at home in France, and then provided they have to return there every day. So this has really simplified the tax returns for those individuals. Now, the new agreement means for them that they can work at home 40% of their time in order to remain taxable in France. So they can work for home and they don't shift into the other system. So the other designation then is cross-border workers. So they are taxed, like the workers we have here, are taxed at work and they declare annually back at home again. So the new agreement for those cross-border workers is again the 40% maximum. They can work from home to remain taxable then in Switzerland. So it suits them to be taxed in Switzerland rather than in France. So it's a very simplified system. They've come up with a system that works for them in a very, very specific zone, but it doesn't include social insurance. So when we look at what's happening then in the social insurance as well, but first in tax, to say that there is certainly global discussions, international discussions now at potentially looking at a complete review of how individuals are taxed across border. So the international corporate taxation framework has recently been overhauled, and it appears that there are moves now to do the same thing for individuals. So with that in mind, the EU are getting all their ducks in a row, and a briefing that's come out from the advisory body then of the EU, the European Economic and Social Committee, they had a briefing that was issued in July of last year, and it was very, very positive about the opportunities there of the continuation of remote working, remote teleworking as they called it. You know, they say this is a pattern that's not only going to continue, but is likely to rise. They mentioned that the hybrid working patterns protect a person's right to work at home while also still facilitating their right to free movement within the EU member states. And then it also talks about helping the fact that people aren't on the road just as often with their commuting, that it's helping the EU to meet their Green Deal goals. So there's lots of positive things. Now, lots of the collaboration that they talk about within that opinion piece will take a significant amount of coordination. So while all of that discussion is taking place, some member states have already been keeping pace with the need, and they have introduced their own bilaterals, and the EU response is certainly gathering up momentum. And they've certainly got their act together then in regards to social insurance. So it's called the Administrative Commission for the Coordination of Social Security Systems, so we call it the ASE. They have recently invited member states plus, so that's your Liechtenstein, Norway, and the United Kingdom is in there as well. So I think there's 32 countries altogether have been invited to opt into this framework that will replace that 25% rule. So people will be able to work from home for 49.9%, almost 50% of their time, without the jurisdiction responsible for their social insurance swapping to home. So at the moment, it's 25%. Once you go beyond a day, it'll all switch to home, and all those knock-on effects that Martin mentioned in the examples, switches in social insurance, and those payments will go to the home, the place of home. So this new framework, it's an opt-in, it's a reshape, a rejig of the existing legislation, so they don't need to go through that whole there's wiggle room within the existing legislation to allow them to do that. And those that sign up, this can actually take effect from the 1st of July 2023. Now, so far, 17 member states have indicated, I've been having discussions with the Irish officials, And they tell me that so far 17 member states or 17 countries have indicated that they will opt into this. Now, others might choose not to because they have already set up bilaterals. So that would be like Germany has set up bilateral agreements on Social Security with Austria and the Czech Republic, for example, and that will take them to the 40% rule. So not quite the 49.9, but at least it would take them to the, beyond the 25%. So feedbacks from Irish officials suggest that Ireland will sign up to this. So that's good. The big but in capital letters is they do not expect the EU to opt in at this point. Now, this can change. The 1st of July 2023 is not a deadline. That's just when it can begin. For those that opt in by that date, that's when it kicks off. Whenever others opt in at a later date, that later date will apply to them. So it can't go backwards. It will only start from the date that they sign up. So we need to keep an eye on this because, particularly within the centre, we've always been talking about watching out for divergence between the jurisdictions. Now, what we have uncovered then is, and we have more learning to do on this. Now, this is quite new to me. What would happen then is that if the UK did opt in, it would appear that because it's a tweak to an existing piece of legislation, it's 883, the Social Security coordination rules, it would apply to those people who are protected by the withdrawal agreement. So that's our frontier workers who existed at the end of transition, which was the end of December 2020. So they're protected. For everyone else, they're looking to the EU-UK protocol and their protocol on Social Security, and that it wouldn't be included in that. So I suppose we are comforted that we do have the Irish and UK Convention that is almost a replica of 883 and the EU Social Security rules, which is really, really good. But will it keep pace? Will it be updated? So this is something that, alarm bells went off in my head. But as I said, I have more learning to do about this, and I'll keep you up to date. If anybody knows anything about it, please drop me an email and I'll help to get the word out there. But effectively, in my mind, it would mean that if Ireland opted in and the UK opted out, that would mean that an Irish company who may be based in Dublin, right by the airport, they could offer better terms, working from home terms, to say a resident of France. They could fly in, spend half their working week and their weekend at home, and just fly in for half the week then into Dublin, and they would meet the criteria, whereas somebody who's in Uri would only be offered that 25%. So that's really not good enough. But as I say, we have more learning to do on this one, so I just wanted to throw that out there. So we have to keep an eye on that. So mindful of what's happening here then, particularly at the beginning of COVID, and when it appeared that during COVID, all of these rules that we talked about all paused. So the authorities pretended that the people were crossing the border to go to their place of work. So the rules, we didn't have to worry about the rules that we're talking about now today. But with everything reinstated again, or with that looming, there was a considerable amount of lobbying into government, particularly on the southern side of the border. It's more difficult here whenever we don't have a government to lobby to. But there was a significant amount of lobbying calling for simplified processes, even just a few tweaks that could make life much more easy for cross-border workers and for employers who are struggling at times to get the skills they need. So there was a lot of lobbying happening, and we know that there's lots of discussion happening at the moment in Revenue and in the Department of Finance. And we know that I think there's colleagues from ESRI on the call this morning, that there is research being carried out on the numbers of cross-border workers here. No one's counting, and that is normal in cross-border border regions. It's really difficult to get the data, and we know there are many going under the radar. So they are capturing in that report numbers of workers and the challenges that they encounter. So we have to keep an eye on, whenever this research come out, where else do we look to tell the story of what's happening here and what could happen here, because it's not just about the people that we know of, either that are being counted on the systems, or the people that we personally know of that are taking opportunities across the border. What is the untapped potential? What could it be if the red tape wasn't there, stopping people in their tracks to take great opportunities, to hire great people, or to take great job opportunities. The untapped potential has to be factored into this as well, you know, so it has to be policies that are made to encourage people, you know, to make things flourish and to blossom. So I suppose what we need to do here, Rose, I know that you were part of discussions from time to time, part of that lobbying. Is there anything you want to jump in to mention? What have I'm mindful of time, so I'm talking quite quick.
That's all right. Yeah, I was involved with a few meetings with the Department of Finance, and I think some of the people might be on the call today, and also with revenue as well. And I suppose the thrust of some of those meetings was around the transborder workers relief, but really you can't fix that piece unless you fix the foreign employer registration piece first. That's my view anyway. And in terms of the recent research, that's great. There's been a survey done and commissioned by the Department of Finance, and it'll tweak out some areas and sectors, and that the people are actually working from home and remote working. It was mainly focused on the remote working. In terms of numbers of cross-border workers, I mean, the Department of Finance report that came out through revenue as well, through the Commission on Taxation report, I should say, it talked about very low numbers of cross-border workers, but that was based on the number of people who had filed Irish tax returns and claimed trans-border workers relief. There's only 1,700 or 1,900 in a couple of years they looked at. I mean, that's not the numbers of cross-border workers, as we know. The simple way of actually finding out how many cross-border workers is that revenue have all that live data on their payroll systems. Every PPS number that's attached to an NI address and it's live on current payrolls, real-time information. They're all cross-border workers, whether they're working from home or whether they're working across the border and commuting, they're all cross-border workers. And likewise, HMRC is the same information. You know, with anybody who's got an NIC number live on a payroll who has an Irish address and their employer has a Northern Ireland address is clearly a cross-border worker. So that information is readily available because we know that the quality of data that both Revenue and HMRC have is vast, and you know, it can be drilled into. So I'm sure that they could come up with the actual numbers. Because I see Manus here to ask a question on the chat, and I was answering him in relation to, does this affect ordinary businesses that just have people working outside of the border, like carrying out deliveries and things? And I said, yes, these rules have been around since 2006. These are not new. They didn't come up because of COVID. I mean, but an awful lot of the border employers are either unaware of them or keeping their heads down because it's so complex for them. It's a bit of a nightmare. I mean, they're not designed for a land border. They're designed for global mobility, people flying in and out of the country. We can track the days they're in different jurisdictions. They're not about sending somebody to the post office in Clonus and, you know, how many times across the border getting there and back again. That's not what they're designed for. And so what we really need is more geographically appropriate, and that's your phrase, Anne-Marie, you like it, geographically appropriate legislation for this area, or tweak the current legislation that accommodates people in this area. And I suppose that's what we're driving towards here, is trying to find the right people to have that conversation, to add to the mix of ideas that there are to do this. I can't hear you now.
Sorry, Rose, thank you so much. That absolutely bang on with that. And I think what we need to do then, you know, with the centre here and with the project, we'll keep our eye on all of this and keep working, and we'll keep plugging it, and we'll keep in touch with you all. But I suppose our call to action at the moment is what we have at the moment is a really good group online of cross-border practitioners, of citizens advisors and information providers. So there's a particular level of advice that's happening and complex conversations that's happening in that group when we meet once a month. But what we're finding, particularly with the working from home, is that people need such specific information, I got tongue-tied there, that is financial, that we're almost a little bit hesitant now to say, look, hold on, we have got to find you a cross-border advisor. Now, there's only so many hours in the day that Martin and Rose could work, and there's all these other questions that we have as well, and that, you know, that we discuss amongst ourselves, that, you know, are just broader, and particularly with employment law as well, you know, coming into the thing with contracts and that. So what we're kind of keen to do now is to get another practitioners group going of experts, a small group of trusted experts that the network then of citizens advisor can have confidence to signpost on to. We also want to pull those people together, that we can have conversations to look at ideas, to share information. I found this works for me. This does not work for me. I've got a case that's tricky. Where do we go? You know, so a trusted space where there would be a little bit of sharing, and I think this is going to be absolutely key for the advice sector to have trust whenever they signpost people out. You know, when it gets beyond the advice sector, and when it's really technical, financial and law, employment law advice. So I'm going to send out an email to you all after this with the briefing paper and an invitation to join both of these, depending on which group that you're in. I know that there could be some individuals as well who are on the call, maybe with a couple of hats on, so they could also be frontier workers or cross-border workers. We have an online page, a group on Facebook, where there's a bit of discussion from time to time. Somebody will have a problem, they can post up a question anonymously, and then others will jump in and say, oh yeah, well, I had this issue, or talk to Martin, or talk to Rose, or whatever it is, contact Child Benefit Office, that here's the number. So there's a bit of collaboration behind the scenes then that people do for themselves. So I think there's 350 people, I think, in that group, and the vast majority of them are based here on this island. We turn down people all the time whenever they're asking to join from other places. We need to keep it as local as possible. So again, I'll share the link in the email that'll go out in a couple of days, so you know that you can join either one of those. We'll certainly have your email, so we'll keep you in the loop about anything new that we find out, and definitely please keep in touch with us if you come across anything you think that others would find useful, or you have a question and you think we might be useful to you. Drop us a line, absolutely. It'd be great to hear from you. There's the contact details, and again, these will be shared with you. So we've 9 minutes. We did it. I thought that we go 9 minutes early, so it's great to have to be able to end on time there. And I think we've covered so much, I think we should leave it there. So unless I see one thing in the chat, but I'm not sure what it is. So so we call it a day, if that's okay, unless anyone, if you have a question, throw it in the chat very quickly, but I think we should call it a day, I think.
Thanks, Anne-Marie.
All right, take care, folks.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. Well done.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne-Marie.
Keep in touch.
Cheers, Anne-Marie.